The pre-Socratic puzzle. What is time? After exploring how ancient myths imagined unusual relationships with time, we now turn to ancient philosophers who asked more abstract questions. What is time, really? Does it exist independently, or only in our minds? Can the past and future be said to exist in any meaningful sense? These questions might seem overly abstract, but they're actually essential for thinking about time travel. After all, if you're going to travel to the past has to exist in some sense. If it's completely gone, vanished, erased from existence, then there's nowhere to travel to. Similarly, if the future doesn't exist yet, how could you travel to it? The earliest Greek philosophers, called the pre-Socratics, wrestled with these questions in ways that still influence how we think today. We've already mentioned Heraclitus, who believed that everything was constantly changing and that time was inseparable from this change. His famous statement, "You cannot step into the same river twice," meant that the river is different each moment, and so are you. Change is the fundamental reality, and time is the measure of this change. If Heraclitus was right, then the past is truly gone. The river you stepped in yesterday doesn't exist anymore. It has flowed on and become a different river. Only the present moment is real. The past is just memory, and the future is just possibility. This view makes time travel seem impossible. How can you travel to something that doesn't exist? If only the present moment is real, and the past and future are mere abstractions, then time travel would be like trying to travel to a place that has been completely destroyed or hasn't been built yet. Parmenides, as we mentioned earlier, took the opposite view. He argued that change itself was an illusion. True reality, he claimed, was eternal and unchanging. Everything that appears to change, including time itself, is just an illusion created by our faulty senses. If Parmenides was right, then in some sense all moments of time might exist simultaneously in an eternal, unchanging reality. Past, present, and future would all be equally real, and our experience of moving through time would be illusory. This view is more compatible with time travel. If all moments of time exist simultaneously, then traveling from one to another might be possible. You just need to find a way to access different parts of this eternal, timeless reality. A third pre-Socratic philosopher, Zeno of Elea, created a series of paradoxes that challenged common-sense ideas about time and motion. The most famous is the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine Achilles, the fastest runner, racing against a tortoise, the slowest creature. To be fair, the tortoise gets a head start. Now, Zeno argued, Achilles can never overtake the tortoise. Why? Because first Achilles must reach the point where the tortoise started. But by the time he reaches that point, the tortoise has moved a little further ahead. Then Achilles must reach this new point, but by the time he does, the tortoise has moved ahead again. This continues infinitely. Achilles keeps getting closer but never quite catches up. Of course, in reality, Achilles easily overtakes the tortoise. We see fast runners overtake slow ones all the time. But Zeno's paradox challenged philosophers to explain why the logical argument was wrong. The paradox suggested that our common-sense understanding of time and motion might be flawed or incomplete. Zeno's paradoxes raised deep questions. Is time infinitely divisible, or does it have smallest units? If you could divide moments of time infinitely, could motion ever actually happen? These questions wouldn't be fully resolved until modern mathematics developed calculus, more than 2,000 years later. These early philosophical explorations taught humanity to think critically about time rather than just accepting it as obvious. They revealed that time was mysterious and puzzling, full of logical complications that weren't immediately apparent. This intellectual groundwork was necessary before anyone could seriously imagine traveling through time. Plato's eternal forms and time as an image. Plato, one of the most influential philosophers in history, developed a theory about time that would echo through Western thought for thousands of years. Plato believed that the physical world we experience is not the ultimate reality. Instead, it's like a shadow or reflection of a higher reality, the world of forms, sometimes called ideas. In this higher reality, perfect, eternal forms exist. The form of beauty, the form of justice, the form of circle, and so on. Everything in our physical world is an imperfect copy of these eternal forms. A beautiful painting is beautiful because it participates in the form of beauty. A circle drawn on paper is circular because it reflects the form of circle, though it's not perfectly circular like the form. Where does time fit into this? According to Plato, time exists only in the physical world, not in the realm of forms. The forms are eternal and timeless. They don't change, don't age, don't come into being or pass away. They simply are forever. In Plato's dialogue, Timaeus, he describes time as a moving image of eternity. What he meant was that time is the physical world's attempt to imitate the eternal, timeless existence of the forms. The physical world can't be truly eternal. Everything in it changes and eventually perishes. But time gives it a kind of pseudo-eternity by creating a continuous progression of moments. Think of it like a movie. A movie isn't truly moving. It's actually a series of still images shown rapidly one after another, creating the illusion of motion and continuity. In a similar way, Plato suggested, time creates the illusion of continuous existence by stringing moments together, even though each moment passes and is replaced by the next. This theory has interesting implications for time travel. If the forms exist in an eternal, timeless realm, and if the human soul, which Plato believed was immortal, has access to this realm, then perhaps the soul can exist outside of time. Perhaps, through philosophical contemplation or mystical experience, one could access this timeless realm and thereby escape time's flow. Plato didn't specifically discuss time travel, but his philosophy created a conceptual framework where escaping time might be possible. Not through physical travel, but through spiritual or intellectual transcendence. Plato also believed in reincarnation. He thought souls were reborn into new bodies over and over again. In a sense, this is a kind of time travel. The soul experiences different time periods by being born into them. Between incarnations, in Plato's view, the soul existed in the timeless realm of forms before descending back into the physical world of time. Aristotle's treatment of time as the measure of change. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, disagreed with many of his teacher's ideas and developed his own theory of time. Unlike Plato, Aristotle didn't believe in a separate realm of eternal forms. For Aristotle, reality was right here in the physical world. And time, he argued, was fundamentally connected to change and motion. In his work Physics, Aristotle defined time as the number of motion with respect to before and after. In simpler language, time is how we measure change. When things move or change, time passes. The faster things change, the more time we perceive passing. This immediately raises a fascinating question. Could time exist without change? Aristotle thought not. If absolutely nothing in the entire universe moved or changed, if everything was completely frozen and static, would time still pass? Aristotle argued that it wouldn't. Time and change are so intimately connected that you can't have one without the other. This is different from our modern understanding, as we'll see when we get to Einstein, but it was a powerful idea that influenced thinking for centuries. Aristotle also grappled with the question of whether the past and future exist. His answer was subtle. They don't exist in the same way the present does, but they're not complete non-existence either. The present, Aristotle said, is the only moment that fully exists. The past existed but doesn't anymore. The future will exist but doesn't yet. However, the past still has a kind of reality in our memories and in the effects it's left behind. The ruins of ancient buildings, for example, are present realities that were caused by past events. Similarly, the future has a kind of reality in present causes that will produce future effects. This view makes time travel problematic. If the past doesn't exist anymore except as memory and effects, how could you travel to it? It's not there to travel to. However, Aristotle's emphasis on cause and effect would become important for later thinking about time travel paradoxes. If every effect must have a cause that precedes it in time, what happens if you travel back in time and prevent your own cause, your own birth, for example? This paradox wouldn't be fully explored until much later, but Aristotle's work on causation laid the groundwork for it. Augustine's puzzle, the mystery of time. As we move from ancient Greece to the early Christian era, we encounter St. Augustine, whose reflections on time remain some of the most profound and puzzling ever written. Augustine was a philosopher and theologian in the late Roman Empire, 4th to 5th century CE. In his autobiography, Confessions, he included a long meditation on the nature of time that begins with a famous statement of confusion. What then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to someone who asks, I do not know. Augustine was expressing something we've all felt. Time seems obvious and familiar when we're just experiencing it, but the moment we try to think carefully about what time actually is, it becomes deeply mysterious and confusing. Augustine wrestled with the same question that had troubled earlier philosophers. Do the past and future exist? He reasoned that the past no longer exists, it's gone. The future doesn't exist yet, it hasn't arrived. And the present is just an infinitesimally brief instant between past and future, with no duration at all. So where is time? What is it made of? Augustine's answer was radical. Time exists in the mind. The past exists as memory. The future exists as expectation. The present exists as immediate attention. All three, memory, attention, and expectation, are mental activities happening right now in the present. Think about it. When you remember yesterday, you're not actually visiting yesterday. Yesterday is gone. Instead, you're having a present experience of remembering. The memory exists now in your mind. Similarly, when you think about tomorrow, tomorrow doesn't exist yet. What exists is your present act of anticipation. Augustine concluded that time is a distension of the mind, a stretching out of mental awareness across past, present, and future. Without minds to remember and anticipate, there might be change and succession, but there wouldn't be time as we know it. This theory has intriguing implications for time travel. If time is fundamentally mental, then perhaps traveling through time is really about accessing different states of mind or different modes of awareness. Perhaps what we need isn't a time machine but a different way of organizing consciousness. Augustine also confronted the theological question of how God relates to time. If God created everything, did God create time? And if so, what does it mean to ask what God was doing before creation, since before is a time word and time didn't exist yet? Augustine's answer was that God exists outside of time altogether. God is eternal, which doesn't mean lasting forever in time, but rather existing in a timeless, eternal present, where all moments are simultaneously present to God's awareness. From God's perspective, there is no past or future. Everything is now. This idea of a timeless eternity, where all time is simultaneously present, would become a recurring theme in Christian theology and would later influence science fiction writers imagining how time travel might work. Boethius and the eternal present. Building on Augustine's ideas, the philosopher Boethius, who lived in the 6th century CE, developed the concept of the eternal present even further. Boethius was facing execution for treason, a charge he considered unjust, when he wrote his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. In prison, awaiting death, he meditated on time, eternity, and divine providence. Boethius drew a distinction between two different kinds of existence, temporal and eternal. Temporal existence is what we experience, moving through time from past to present to future. Eternal existence is what God experiences, existing outside of time altogether in an eternal present. Boethius used an analogy to explain this. Imagine you're walking on a road. As you walk, you pass through different places in sequence. First you're here, then you're there, then you're somewhere else. You can only be in one place at a time. Now imagine someone on a high tower overlooking the entire road. From that elevated perspective, they can see the entire road at once, the part you've already walked where you are now and the part you'll walk tomorrow. They see it all simultaneously. God's relationship to time, Boethius suggested, is like the person in the tower. While we experience time as a succession of moments, God sees all moments at once in an eternal present. God doesn't foresee the future in the sense of knowing about it before it happens. Rather, God sees the future the same way God sees the past and present, all at once in an eternal now. This raises an interesting puzzle about free will and predestination. If God sees all of time at once, including all our future choices, does that mean our choices are predetermined?
Boethius argued no.
Just because God sees what we will choose doesn't mean God is forcing us to choose it. God's knowledge is like watching something happen, not causing it to happen. For our purposes, Boethius's eternal present is interesting because it's a model of how all times could exist simultaneously. If time is like a landscape that can be viewed all at once from a high enough perspective, then perhaps time travel is a matter of finding a way to access that higher perspective, to step outside of normal sequential time and view it from an eternal standpoint. This wouldn't be time travel in the sense of physically moving to a different era. It would be more like gaining a God's eye view of all times at once. Some mystical traditions would explore exactly this idea, suggesting that enlightenment or spiritual advancement involve transcending sequential time. Islamic philosophy, Al-Ghazali and occasionalism. Moving beyond European philosophy, Islamic philosophers in the medieval period developed their own sophisticated theories about time, causation, and God's relationship to the world. One of the most influential was Al-Ghazali, 11th to 12th century CE, who developed a theory called occasionalism. This theory had radical implications for how time and causation work. According to occasionalism, what we think of as cause and effect is an illusion. When we see one billiard ball hit another and the second ball moves, we think the first ball caused the second ball's motion. But Al-Ghazali argued that God is the only true cause of everything. The first ball doesn't make the second ball move. Rather, God creates the motion of the second ball on the occasion of the first ball touching it. Why does this matter for thinking about time? Because it means that each moment is created by God independently. God doesn't just create the universe at the beginning and let it run according to natural laws. Instead, God continuously creates every moment, constantly sustaining everything in existence from instant to instant. One moment doesn't cause the next moment. God creates each moment fresh, though usually out of custom and mercy. God makes each moment similar to the previous one, giving us the impression of continuous, lawful existence. This view makes time very different from the Western philosophical tradition. Time isn't a container in which events occur, nor is it an aspect of change and motion. Instead, each moment is a discrete act of divine creation. If this view is correct, then time travel becomes theoretically possible in an interesting way. If God creates each moment independently, then there's no reason in principle why God couldn't create a moment that corresponds to what we think of as the past. God could recreate a previous moment or create you in a state that corresponds to your existence at a different time. Of course, Al-Ghazali didn't actually propose time travel. He was concerned with theological questions, not science fiction. But his philosophy created a conceptual framework where rearranging temporal sequence wouldn't be impossible, just unusual. Other Islamic philosophers disagreed with Al-Ghazali. Averroes Ibn Rushd, for example, defended a more Aristotelian view where natural causes were real, and where time had an objective existence connected to motion and change. These debates within Islamic philosophy paralleled similar debates in Christian and Jewish philosophy. Maimonides and Jewish philosophy of time. Jewish philosophy, too, grappled with questions about time, eternity, and God's relationship to creation. Maimonides, 12th century CE, one of the most important Jewish philosophers, tried to reconcile biblical teachings with Aristotelian philosophy. One of his main concerns was the question of whether the world had always existed or whether it was created at a specific moment in time. Aristotle had argued that the universe was eternal. It had always existed and always would exist. This seemed to contradict the biblical account of creation, where God creates the world at a specific beginning point. Maimonides argued that the world was indeed created, but that before creation, time didn't exist. Time was created along with the physical universe. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to ask what God was doing before creation, because there was no before. Time itself began when the universe began. This idea that time had a beginning seems obvious to us now, especially given modern cosmology's Big Bang theory. But in Maimonides' era, it was a controversial claim that required careful philosophical argument. If time had a beginning, though, interesting questions arise. Is time infinite into the future, or will it have an end? Can time exist without physical change and motion, or are they inseparable? Will there be an end of time when God brings history to its conclusion? Maimonides also grappled with the question of divine foreknowledge. If God knows the future, does that eliminate human free will? His solution was similar to Boethius's. God's knowledge is different from human knowledge. God doesn't know things by reasoning from present evidence to future predictions. Instead, God knows things in a timeless way that doesn't interfere with human freedom. These medieval philosophical debates might seem distant from time travel, but they're actually quite relevant. They established several ideas that would become important later. The idea that time might not be absolute and uniform, it might have different qualities or might not even exist in all circumstances. The idea that beings like God might exist outside of time and view all times simultaneously. The idea that knowledge of the future doesn't necessarily eliminate free will or cause events to happen. The question of whether time has a beginning and/or an end. All of these ideas would eventually feed into time travel theories and stories. Medieval European thought, time and eternity. In medieval Europe, Christian philosophers continued to develop theories about time, building on Augustine, Boethius, and Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century CE, perhaps the most systematic medieval philosopher, tried to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. Following Aristotle, he understood time as connected to motion and change. Time is the measure of before and after in motion. But Aquinas also maintained, following Augustine and Boethius, that God exists outside of time in eternity. Eternity isn't just time lasting forever. It's a completely different mode of existence where there is no succession, no before and after, no past or future. Aquinas used the analogy of a river flowing past a point on the shore versus someone viewing the entire river from a mountain. The person on the shore sees the water flow past in succession. First this water, then that water. But someone on the mountain sees the whole river at once. Similarly, we experience time as successive moments, but God sees all of time at once from the perspective of eternity. This raised a subtle philosophical question. If God knows what will happen in the future, is the future already determined? Aquinas argued that from God's eternal perspective, everything is present. So God isn't foreseeing the future, but simply seeing it. And just as my seeing you walk doesn't cause you to walk, God's seeing our future actions doesn't cause them or remove our free will. Duns Scotus, 13th to 14th century CE, another medieval philosopher, disagreed with some of Aquinas' conclusions and developed a more complex theory of time and possibility. Scotus was very interested in questions of contingency and possibility. The actual world, the world that exists, is only one of many possible worlds that could have existed. God chose to create this particular world, but God could have created different worlds with different histories. This notion of multiple possible worlds, all equally real in some sense until God's creative choice selected one, would eventually influence thinking about parallel timelines and alternate histories, ideas that became common in time travel fiction. Scotus also wrestled with the question of whether the past can be changed. His answer was nuanced. The past cannot be changed in the sense that what happened, happened. It's logically impossible for an event both to have happened and not to have happened. However, there's a sense in which even past events depend on God's will, since God could have created a different world with a different past. This distinction between logical possibility and actual possibility would become important in later debates about time travel paradoxes. The philosophical legacy for time travel thinking. These ancient and medieval philosophers didn't write about time machines or journeys to different eras, but their abstract explorations of time's nature created the conceptual foundations for later time travel thinking. From these philosophical traditions, several key ideas emerged. The question of whether all times exist. Do past and future exist in some sense, or only the present? If only the present exists, time travel seems impossible. But if all times exist in some way, time travel might mean navigating between them. The possibility of existing outside time. If there can be a timeless realm, eternity, or a timeless being, God, perhaps beings or souls could access this timeless state and thereby escape or transcend time's flow. The relationship between time and change. Is time just the measure of change, or can it exist independently? Could time stop if all motion stopped, or is time something more fundamental? The possibility of viewing all time simultaneously. If God or enlightened beings can see all of time at once, perhaps humans could develop abilities or technologies to do the same. Questions about causation and free will. If effects must follow causes in time, what happens when time travel creates loops or paradoxes? How can we maintain free will if the future already exists? These philosophical foundations were essential preparation for the imagination of time travel. Before anyone could write convincing stories about traveling through time, or develop scientific theories about whether such travel was possible, They needed this philosophical groundwork. These thousands of years of careful thought about what time is and how it works. The stage was now set for time travel to move from abstract philosophy into vivid imaginative literature, which is where our journey takes us next. The birth of time travel fiction from folklore to literature. The transition from myth to story. So far, we've explored ancient myths where time worked strangely and philosophical theories about time's nature. Now we're going to see how time travel transformed from religious myth and abstract philosophy into something new. Deliberate fictional narratives. This transition happened gradually over several centuries, roughly from the 1600s to the 1800s. During this period, Western culture experienced major changes. The scientific revolution changed how people understood the natural world. The printing press made books widely available. Literacy spread. And fiction, stories that were openly acknowledged to be invented rather than passed down myths or legends, became a popular form of entertainment. As fiction developed, writers began to play with ideas that myths had only touched upon. What if someone could truly visit the past or future? Not through religious visions or mystical experiences, but through some explicable means. What would they see? How would they get there? What would happen? These early time travel stories were often clumsy by modern standards. The mechanisms for time travel were vague or magical. The paradoxes weren't fully thought through. But these stories were important first steps, bridging the gap between ancient myths and modern science fiction. Early precursors, sleeping through time. One of the simplest ways to travel into the future is to sleep through the intervening time. Several early stories used this device. The ancient Greek story of Epimenides tells of a shepherd who fell asleep in a cave and didn't wake up for 57 years. When he emerged, everything had changed. This isn't really time travel, the time passes normally. Epimenides just wasn't conscious for it. But the effect is similar. He experiences the future without experiencing the time between. A similar Jewish legend tells of Honi the circle drawer, who fell asleep and woke up 70 years later to find a different world. Again, this is sleep rather than true time travel, but it creates a similar narrative situation. A person displaced in time, encountering a world they don't understand. The most famous version of this trope is Rip Van Winkle, written by Washington Irving in 1819. In this American story, Rip Van Winkle encounters strange men playing ninepins in the mountains. He drinks their liquor and falls into a deep sleep. When he wakes up, 20 years have passed. The American Revolution has happened while he slept. His wife has died, his children are grown, and his old life is gone. Rip Van Winkle isn't time travel in the science fiction sense. There's no time machine, no bending of space-time. But it explores themes that would become central to time travel fiction. The shock of finding yourself in an unfamiliar future, the loss of everyone you knew, the difficulty of adapting to changed circumstances. Irving was drawing on older folklore, particularly the story of the Sleepers of Ephesus, a Christian legend about 7 young men who hid in a cave to escape persecution, fell asleep, and woke up 200 years later to find that Christianity was now the established religion. All these sleep stories served a similar narrative purpose. They allowed the storyteller to comment on how society had changed over time, to explore themes of loss and alienation, and to give readers the vicarious experience of seeing their own world from an outsider's perspective. Samuel Madden's Memoirs of the 20th Century, 1733. One of the earliest works to seriously attempt fictional time travel was Samuel Madden's Memoirs of the 20th Century, published in 1733. This book is structured as a series of letters supposedly written in the year 1997 to 1998, which were delivered to the author in 1728 by an angel. In other words, it's a story told from the future, brought back to the present through supernatural means. The device is fairly transparent. Madden wanted to write speculative fiction about the future, and he invented the angel delivery system to frame it. The book is more notable for being an early attempt at future speculation than for literary quality. Madden's predictions were wildly wrong. He imagined a future where the Ottoman Empire still dominated world affairs, and where religious conflicts continued exactly as in his own time. But what's significant is that Madden felt the need to create some mechanism, even a supernatural one, to explain how information from the future could reach the present. He couldn't just write about the future directly. He needed a narrative justification for future knowledge. This shows that even in early fiction, writers sensed that accessing other times required some kind of explanation, some device or mechanism to make it possible. The idea that you could just magically see the future without any reason seemed unsatisfying even to 18th century readers. Louis Sebastian Mercier's The Year 2440, 1771. A more successful early work of future speculation was Louis Sebastian Mercier's L'An 2440, The Year 2440. A Dream If Ever There Was One, published in France in 1771. As the title suggests, Mercier used the dream device. His narrator falls asleep and dreams that he wakes up in the year 2440, over 600 years in the future. He walks through a transformed Paris and observes how society has improved. Mercier was an optimist who believed human progress would create a better world. In Mercier's future Paris, reason and enlightenment have triumphed. There are reforms in education, government, and social organization. Slavery has been abolished, society is more egalitarian, and science has advanced significantly. Like Rip Van Winkle after it, the year 2440 isn't really time travel. It's a dream vision. But unlike traditional religious visions of the future, like those in the Book of Revelation, Mercier's vision was explicitly secular and based on extrapolation from current trends. He was trying to imagine how human society could evolve over time, not describing a divinely ordained prophecy. This marks an important shift in how fiction treated the future. The future wasn't predetermined by fate or divine plan. It was something that would be shaped by human choices and actions. And that meant the future could be imagined, speculated about, and even influenced by describing possible outcomes. Mercier's book was quite popular and influential. It was translated into several languages and read widely. It showed that there was an audience for speculative fiction about the future, setting the stage for later, more sophisticated time travel stories. Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, 1843. Charles Dickens's famous novella, A Christmas Carol, isn't usually thought of as a time travel story, but it contains several elements that are relevant to the evolution of time travel fiction. The main character, Ebenezer Scrooge, is visited by three ghosts: the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Each ghost takes Scrooge on a journey through time. The ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge back to visit scenes from his own earlier life. He observes his younger self, his lonely childhood, his time as an apprentice, his engagement that was broken off due to his growing obsession with money. These scenes aren't just memories. Scrooge actually observes them playing out, as if he's there watching them happen. The ghost of Christmas present shows Scrooge what's happening right now in different places, the homes of his clerk Bob Cratchit and his nephew Fred. Though this isn't time travel, it's a similar device. Scrooge is made invisible and transported to witness scenes he couldn't normally see. Most importantly, the ghost of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge the future. Specifically, what will happen if he doesn't change his ways. He sees people celebrating someone's death, then realizes it's his own death they're celebrating. He sees Bob Cratchit's son, Tiny Tim, dead. He sees his own grave, neglected and unmourned. But this future isn't fixed. The whole point of the story is that Scrooge can change. When he wakes up on Christmas morning, he's still alive. It's still Christmas, and he hasn't missed it. He still has time to change the future he was shown. This introduces an important concept for time travel fiction: the difference between a determined future and a changeable future. The ghost shows Scrooge the shadows of things that may be, not that will be. As Dickens writes, the future can be altered by present choices. This optimistic view of time, that we can change the future through our actions, would become one common approach in time travel fiction, contrasting with the Greek tragic view where fate is inescapable. Edward Page Mitchell and early time machine stories. By the late 1800s, as scientific thinking became more prevalent, writers began to imagine more mechanical, less supernatural ways of traveling through time. Edward Page Mitchell, an American journalist and writer, published several early science fiction stories, including The Clock That Went Backward in 1881. This story features an antique clock that, when wound in a particular way, sends the characters back in time. The story is set during the Siege of Leiden in 1574. The characters find themselves in the past, participating in historical events. This is one of the first stories where people physically travel to the past, rather than just dreaming about it or receiving visions, and interact with historical events. Mitchell's mechanism, the clock, is vague and magical. We're not given a scientific explanation for how the clock works. It's essentially a plot device, a way to get the characters into the past so the story can happen. But it's significant that Mitchell chose a mechanical object, a clock, which measures time, rather than a ghost, angel, or magical spell. This reflects the late 19th century's fascination with machinery and technology. The Industrial Revolution had transformed daily life with steam engines, telegraphs, and countless other inventions. It seemed plausible that some mechanical device might someday manipulate time itself. Mitchell also wrote The Tachypomp, 1874, a story involving infinite speed and other early science fiction tales. But his stories were published in newspapers and forgotten for many years, so he didn't have the immediate influence that the next author we'll discuss would have.
Enrique Gaspàs, a l'Anacronopeta, 1887.
Before H.G. Wells wrote his famous The Time Machine, a Spanish author named Enrique Gaspar published El Anacronopete, The Time Ship, in 1887. Gaspar's novel features an actual time machine, a ship-like vehicle that can travel through time. The inventor creates it specifically to explore different eras of history. The novel follows the time travelers as they visit various periods, including ancient Spain. The time machine works by traveling backward through time at a carefully calibrated speed, and the travelers must take a special fluid to prevent aging during the journey. This is one of the first attempts to provide a quasi-scientific explanation for time travel, rather than relying on magic or dreams. Unfortunately, Gaspar's novel was written in Spanish and wasn't translated into English until much later, so it had limited influence on the development of English-language science fiction. But it's significant as an independent invention of the time machine concept, showing that multiple writers in different countries were beginning to imagine similar ideas. The late 19th century was clearly a period when time travel was in the air. Multiple authors were independently working towards similar concepts, driven by the era's scientific mindset and the growing popularity of speculative fiction. H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, 1895, and then came the big one, H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, published in 1895. This novella is the work that truly established time travel as a major theme in science fiction. While earlier works had featured time travel, Wells's story was the first to make it central, to think through its implications carefully, and to reach a wide, influential audience. Wells's story begins in Victorian England. The protagonist, known only as the time traveler, invents a machine that can move through time the way vehicles move through space. He demonstrates the concept to skeptical friends by explaining that time is actually a fourth dimension, just like the three dimensions of space. This was a revolutionary idea for most readers in 1895, though it was based on real mathematical developments happening at the time. We'll explore the science of space-time more later. Wells was taking cutting-edge mathematical concepts and making them accessible to general readers through fiction. The time traveler builds his machine and travels forward in time, first jumping ahead cautiously a few hours, then more boldly into the distant future. He arrives in the year 800-2701 CE, where humanity has evolved into two species. On the surface live the Eloi, beautiful but weak and childlike humans who spend their days playing and eating fruit. Below ground live the Morlocks, ape-like creatures who maintain machinery in dark tunnels. At first, the time traveler thinks the Eloi are the descendants of humanity's upper class, living in paradise while the Morlocks do all the work. But he gradually realizes the horrifying truth. The Morlocks aren't servants but predators. They feed on the Eloi, who are essentially livestock bred for consumption. The peaceful surface world is actually a farm, and the Eloi's ease and beauty are products of domestication. This dark vision serves as social commentary on Wells's own time. He was critiquing Victorian class divisions, suggesting that the wealthy leisure class, represented by the Eloi, and the industrial working class, represented by the Morlocks, were diverging into almost different species. The time traveler has adventures and narrowly escapes being eaten by Morlocks. Eventually, he returns to his machine and travels even further forward in time, to an era 30 million years in the future when the sun is dying and Earth is becoming cold and lifeless. He witnesses the end of life on Earth before returning to his own time. Back in Victorian England, he tells his story to his friends, who don't believe him. He departs again on his time machine, promising to return with proof, but never comes back. The narrator is left wondering what happened to him. Did he die in some far future, or is he still traveling through time? What makes The Time Machine so important isn't just that it features a time machine, but that Wells thought seriously about the implications. He considered the physics of time travel. Wells gave his time machine a quasi-scientific basis by describing time as a fourth dimension that could be navigated. The experience of time travel. He described what the time traveler sees and feels as days and nights flicker past, as buildings rise and fall in moments, as the sun arcs across the sky like a streaking light. The social implications. He used the future as a way to comment on present social problems, showing where current trends might lead. The inevitability of change. Everything changes over time. Societies, species, even the Earth itself. Nothing is permanent. The limits of knowledge. Even with a time machine, the time traveler can't fully understand what he sees. He forms theories that turn out to be wrong. Wells's novella was hugely popular and influential. It established many tropes that would become standard in time travel fiction. The time machine as a vehicle or device. The lone inventor who creates it. The journey to the distant future to see how things have changed. The use of time travel to comment on present society. The sense of wonder mixed with horror at what time has wrought. After Wells, time travel was firmly established as a major theme in fiction, and countless authors would follow in his footsteps. Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, 1889. A few years before Wells, Mark Twain had published his own time travel novel, though it took a completely different approach. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is about Hank Morgan, a 19th-century American engineer who receives a head injury and wakes up in England during the time of King Arthur, the 6th century. Unlike Wells's time traveler, who observes the future, Hank actively intervenes in the past. He uses his knowledge of science and technology to present himself as a powerful magician, rivaling Merlin. He becomes powerful in Arthur's court and tries to modernize medieval society, introducing technology, changing social systems, and generally trying to remake the past in the image of the 19th century present. This goes terribly wrong. Hank's interventions lead to catastrophic consequences. The society resists his changes. He introduces weapons and technologies that lead to devastating warfare. The novel ends grimly, with Hank trapped in the past, separated forever from his own time, having destroyed much of what he tried to save. Twain's novel is partly satirical, poking fun at romantic medieval stories and at American faith in technology and progress. But it also raises serious questions about intervening in the past. Should you try to change history if you could? Do you have the right to impose your values on another era? What unintended consequences might result? These questions about changing history and about the responsibilities of time travelers would become central themes in later time travel fiction. Twain doesn't explain how Hank travels to the past. It happens through a blow to the head, which is barely more scientific than a dream or vision. Another blow to the head eventually sends him back to the 19th century, though he's left uncertain about whether his adventure was real or a hallucination. Despite its vague mechanism, A Connecticut Yankee is important because it's one of the first stories to seriously explore what happens when you try to change the past. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. The growing sophistication of time travel fiction. By the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, time travel had become an established literary device, and writers were exploring it with increasing sophistication. Authors began to think more carefully about paradoxes. What happens if you go back in time and meet yourself? What if you prevent your own birth? What if you change something that makes your time travel impossible? Mechanisms. How does time travel work? Is it a machine, a natural phenomenon, a drug, a psychic ability? Different stories offered different answers, some more scientific sounding than others. Rules. Are there laws governing time travel? Can you change the past, or is it fixed? Can you travel to the future, and if so, Is that future guaranteed to happen? Ethics. Should you change history if you can? What responsibilities do time travelers have? Psychology. How does time travel affect the traveler? What's it like to be displaced in time, to lose everyone you knew, to have knowledge of what will happen? Stories like The Time Machine and A Connecticut Yankee opened the door for hundreds of other time travel stories. By the early 20th century, time travel had become a standard science fiction trope. Writers of pulp science fiction magazines published countless time travel tales. Some were simple adventure stories, heroes traveling to dinosaur times or the far future, having exciting adventures and returning home. Others were more thoughtful, exploring philosophical questions about time, causation, and free will. Authors like John W. Campbell, L. Sprague de Camp, Robert A. Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, and many others would develop time travel fiction into a sophisticated subgenre with its own conventions, debates, and classic works. But before we get to those 20th century developments, we need to step back and look at how time travel entered another medium that would prove equally important: visual storytelling through film and television.